Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's briefing from RUSI's Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies, the briefing with Aaron Arnold, the financial expert on the UN North Korea panel of experts. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name is Emil Dow. Some of you might know me. I'm the Senior Research Fellow in the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies, focusing on sanctions and proliferation financing. And I might have worked with you in the past on proliferation financing. If I haven't, then it's a pleasure to meet you all virtually today. As many of you know, at RUSI, we have a long-standing program looking at proliferation financing. So we're very pleased to be able to host Aaron for this briefing today. It's actually the second year now that we're doing this briefing. So maybe it's a tradition once you do it 2 times in a row. And we're especially pleased to be joined by so many friends of our program from governments and private sector around the world. It's always good to see you all here, although it's in a virtual setting. Before we begin and before I introduce Aaron, I'd like to just go through a few housekeeping rules for how we will run the briefing today. So first of all, the event is on the record. And shortly, I will hand over the microphone to Aaron, who will give a presentation on the finance section of the UN Panel of Experts' latest report, which was published at the end of March. And after Aaron's briefing, we will then open for questions from the audience. So if you do have a question, please submit your question using the question and answer, the Q&A function in Zoom. And we ask that you please only use the chat function for any technical difficulties that you're experiencing. So if you have a question for Aaron, direct that to the Q&A box, please. Otherwise, we won't see it. I'd also just like to reiterate that Aaron is the financial expert on the panel, and he will only be able to answer questions about the finance section of the report. So I know, as always, at these events, there's quite a lot of questions and interest around shipping and maritime sanctions, for example. So unfortunately, those questions are not for this briefing. However, the financial networks and the proliferation financing activities behind those shipping and maritime sanctions evasion techniques might be within the scope. Hopefully that makes sense. If in doubt, do submit your question, but we will only be picking questions that have to do with proliferation financing. So before I hand over to Aaron, let me just briefly introduce him. Aaron joined the UN panel of experts on North Korea that monitors the implementation of UN sanctions on North Korea. He joined the panel in 2019. Where he is the financial expert and responsible for the finance section of the report. Before joining the panel in 2019, Aaron was a fellow with the project on managing the atom at Harvard's Belfer Center, where his research focused on sanctions and weapons of mass destruction counter-proliferation policy. He also spent more than a decade as a non-proliferation and counter-proliferation subject matter expert at the US Department of Defense and the US Justice Department, where he specialized in counter-proliferation investigations and operations. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Aaron, who I believe has a short presentation, and then do start submitting your questions during Aaron's remarks, because then I can start to screen through them. And of course, submit questions that you have throughout this briefing today. Thanks for coming here today, Aaron. We're really pleased to have you. Over to you.
Emil, thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning. And once again, thank you to RUSI for the invitation to present this year's final report. As Emil mentioned, my name is Aaron. I'm the US member on the panel and responsible for investigating violations of the financial sanctions regimes. For those that may not necessarily be familiar with our work, right, we're the group responsible for producing a report to the Security Council on the implementation of the UN sanctions against North Korea. We submit 2 reports per our reporting period, which basically runs April to April, year on year. Generally speaking, our reports focus on specific cases of non-compliance and sanctions evasion, with an emphasis on emerging trends and tactics. We also like to include recommendations in our report, which we tend to orient towards member states, but also specific industries. And in fact, in our last three reports, we included several recommendations on the need for better rules and regulations around virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. So I just wanted to highlight some, a couple of a few key points from this year's report, specifically from the finance section. First, I think, per tradition, and similar to our previous reports, we maintain our assessment that Dprk continues to effectively access international financial systems through joint ventures, offshore accounts, shell companies, virtual asset service providers, and overseas banking representatives. The majority of the country's modus operandi in these regards remains relatively unchanged. As we point out, and I'll highlight again that, labor networks that we examined in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, have been able to effectively access global financial systems by exploiting local and regional banks, compliance and due diligence processes and procedures. Actually, in one specific investigation, we looked at a Dprk labor network that was formerly Mansudae Overseas Project, which was a sanctioned entity. The company is now operating as Corman Construction in Senegal. We noted that this had been previously reported in the media, but we were able to obtain additional documentation that highlighted specific TTPs. For example, we noted that the company Corman Construction's name changed from Mansudae, despite being the same individuals, the same addresses, phone numbers, email addresses. After changing the name to Corman Construction, they were able to retain their bank accounts and their work visas, and all of this actually despite several letters to associated entities and member states. We also highlight a similar group operating mainly in the Democratic Republic of the Congo that had branch affiliates in several other regions, several other regions. Like Corman Construction, this group was affiliated with a Dprk entity. In this case, it was Payco Trading, which in respect is a similar revenue generating entity like Mansudae. And in fact, based on our investigation, as well as a significant report by the Century, we recommended this group and its subsidiaries for designation. And we also note with interest in the report that this group and its subsidiaries were likely targeting public works projects to include funds that originated from development grants and loans. Which is something that we really hadn't really focused on in the past, but it's definitely come onto our radar now and is of significant concern. Regarding cryptocurrency, we note in the report that Dprk continues to generate illicit revenue by continuing to target virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. In 2020, last year, we noted that they stole about 320 million in virtual currencies. Obviously, there's a big caveat given the price fluctuations of virtual currencies. So I think that was about at the time of the report. That's subject to change. But we do continue to assess the Dprk, at least in the short term, will continue its cyber attacks against financial institutions and virtual asset service providers. They've seen the most success by targeting cryptocurrency exchange houses through, I would say, relatively sophisticated spear phishing and social engineering attacks that have I would say, improved in the 2 years since I've been on the panel. And probably one of the more recent significant cases, North Korean hackers, for lack of a better word, were able to exfiltrate one exchange's services encryption keys by marketing a malware infected cryptocurrency trading platform to that company's employees. We've noted that before, but it continues to be sort of a technique exploited by Dprk. Similar to our previous report, we continue to have better insights into the country's crypto to fiat laundry process. We noted that Dprk continues to rely on over-the-counter exchange services and brokers, which can, these are continuing to be largely unregulated. And then, and this is an area that continues to be of a significant concern for the panel, which we will continue to investigate, going forward. Finally, let me leave you with some key areas of focus, moving for the panel, for myself going forward. Obviously, with the recent provocations, right, we continue to remain trained on ballistic and nuclear weapon systems. Maritime sanctions evasion activity is going to continue to be a priority portfolio for the panel, as this activity is somewhat similar in fashion year on year. Oh, and that actually reminds me that if you have not yet read RUSI and C4ADS's recent report, Black Gold, I highly recommend taking the time. We'll also, this sort of go around, be taking a much deeper dive into corporate service providers and their role in facilitating sanctions evasion activities. And finally, I think we have better insights and capabilities now that we can continue to peel back the layers on the crypto laundry process. And so we'll be looking forward to continuing aspects of those investigations. So I think that concludes my comments, but I very much look forward to answering any questions that you may have. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Aaron. Really helpful. So I had a read through the finance section of the report, and I thought to kind of structure our Q&A session in the best way possible, I thought we could move through it rather thematically. So I will park the crypto discussion for now, but there's quite a lot of mention in the report about overseas banking representatives. So Dprk nationals or representatives continuing to operate control of accounts outside of the Dprk and facilitate transactions. And then there's a specific, quite a lot of focus on sub-Saharan Africa in particular, and revenue raising activities going on in sub-Saharan Africa. So I wanted to start our Q&A session in that area. So access to bank accounts abroad and the revenue raising activities that go on, particularly in Africa. And we have a question that has been submitted by Daria Dolsakova, who's a research fellow at RUSI. She recently wrote a report about proliferation financing risks in the sub-Saharan African region. And she has a question about the DRC case that you mentioned. So the reporting around this case says that the Dprk nationals opened several dollar-denominated bank accounts in the country to support their operations. So the question really is, something went wrong in the due diligence here, either in the bank or somewhere in the country. So her question is, why do you think something went wrong with the due diligence, and how do we prevent this in the future? Is it a matter of greater capacity building within smaller regional, local institutions and banks? Or are there more systemic issues at play here, such as corruption, that might hinder such efforts?
Thank you. So great question. And I think, I mean, this is it kind of strikes right at the heart of a lot of, why we're doing this, and which ultimately to a lot of our recommendations. But the DRC and actually the Senegal case kind of bring up some interesting some issues when I was speaking to banking representatives and other entities affiliated with these cases. The first is capability and capacity. And what I found was that it was rarely the case that there was not a understanding about the UN sanctions regime, right? So the issue, more often than not, seemed to be an issue of resource and technical capability. And what is becoming very apparent is these a significant resource gap between large and small banks. So member states, US, UK, for example, provide quite a bit of capacity building training globally. And I've actually, people bring this up, and that these are very valuable and useful tools or training sessions. But there's sort of another side of this coin, and that's the resources available to actually conduct the compliance and due diligence. And so if you take a large financial institution that may have access to cutting edge fintech compared to a smaller bank that their staff may be comprised of literally one person who is doing Google searches. And so, quite literally, I had a couple banking representatives who, when we discussed this, they said, well, these company names weren't on the UN sanctions list. Well, that's not exactly how the resolutions are written. But by the same token, they described the methods and the techniques using to sort of, do the deep dives. And, some, in many cases, basic analytic technology was just not available. Or of course, they were, short-staffed in research, in terms of personnel resources. So I think that is a significant and growing problem that I think policymakers, decision makers will sort of really need to think about and address, especially as you continue to draw the private sector into these kind of activities. By the same token, I don't want to discount, how shall I put it, willful ignorance. I don't want to say corruption because I don't know, but there is, I think, I'm not saying this is the case in the Senegal or the DRC case, but there is a lot of circumstantial evidence to suggest that willful ignorance is a factor in some of these cases. So.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. An interesting development that we're watching right now is, of course, the Financial Action Task Force new requirement for risk assessments to be conducted on proliferation financing, and specifically around the implementation of targeted financial sanctions related to North Korea. So it's a requirement that both countries and financial institutions in the private sector in those countries conduct those risk assessments. So it'll be interesting to see how that raises the bar for some of these institutions, because it could just be that they are not aware, because often there's not a sufficient guidance nationally to actually inform their view of risk. And I'm intrigued to see how the FATF risk assessment process will impact the global implementation landscape, particularly as it relates to smaller local institutions who just haven't been exposed to this problem before. So definitely something to watch. There is a lot of the sub-Saharan Africa cases mentioned in the report are specifically around public procurement and kind of government contracts in some cases. And there's a question here asking about that. In terms of the DPRK seeking public procurement contracts, is this a typology which has been mainly observed in sub-Saharan Africa or also in other parts of the world?
So, excellent question. Unfortunately, I don't have the best answer to this, mainly because this is sort of such a new TTP. Actually, so I shouldn't say it's a new TTP, it's new to the panel to a degree. So this is something that we're continuing to look in. You know, I could regale you with our hypotheses about why this is, we tend to be seeing this in sub-Saharan Africa. You know, these are regions with, you know, significant amounts of incoming development grants and loans. So, you know, I think that to a degree, those can be viewed as sort of easy targets for, you know, some of these groups. You know, especially in regions or areas with higher rates of, you know, public corruption, right? But that's, I don't want to say that this is solely or, you know, singularly occurring in sub-Saharan Africa. It's just, you know, in this particular case, in their particular cases, sort of emerged. My guess, right, is that this is actually more or less a common pattern technique. And in fact, we've reported before, and I think in this final report, but I think definitely in the last midterm report about the sale of fishing rights and the possible, the likely public corruption surrounding the sale of fishing rights in China and East Asia, so or Southeast Asia. So you know, it's something that continues to be on the radar that we continue to kind of look out for. You know, we had in this year's report, we not having what I would describe as a solid understanding of, you know, DPRK, you know, kind of what their target sets are, and you know, whether or not this is a specific, you know, thrust for them. We were sort of hesitant to really say, hey, this is a technique, you know, could be, but we did indicate in the report that it was something to be aware of, to be concerned about, something to that in in concert with an appropriate risk assessment should be taken into consideration, and you know, more due diligence on the contractual arrangements and the ultimate service of contractors and subcontractors.
Thanks. I know in the recommendations in this year's report, there's quite a few recommendations that sort of, they deal with different things, but they all kind of come back to this element of market entry provisions. And actually, it's not just so much about detecting sanctions evasion as it happens, but also an acknowledgement that sometimes market entry at the government level is incredibly important, and actually applying due diligence there, because some of these professions and some of these contracts that are awarded might actually involve proliferators. We've been doing some work on gatekeeper professions in particular, so lawyers, accountants, trust and company service providers, around this, and found that quite a few of the cases that have been mentioned in the panel of experts since 2010 and onwards have actually involved insourcing of some of these capabilities. And I think it's definitely an area where governments can do more work, is not just put it all on the private sector to do due diligence, but actually sometimes there's a need for greater market entry controls to prevent these things from happening in the first place. I don't know if you want to comment any further on that, but that's something that I've at least been observing and been thinking about.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting observation. It's very much consistent with Our focus, there are definitely these market entry, kind of aspects that go to a degree under the radar, but play a significant role in sanctions evasion activities. Earlier this morning, I mentioned our increasing focus on corporate service providers, and I think that this is one area where that sort of meets that kind of criteria. The way that the UNSCRs are worded, right, is that it's the supply of financial services directly or indirectly, and I think that indirectly component becomes problematic, right? Directly is easy, you can Google it. Indirect is more of an issue, but corporate service providers that are registering shell companies for Dprk entities or Dprk linked entities, I believe falls under this definition. And so, this obviously, this has been a known, the Dprk's use of, corporate vehicle shell companies to obfuscate its activity, its beneficial ownership information is a well-known, well-exploited technique. And we know that, this is primarily occurring in secrecy jurisdictions, places, we see the predominant, especially like in maritime, for example, when we look at the maritime industry and sort of the, sale of ships, the sale of the oil, the array, the networks of shell companies are predominantly registered in Hong Kong, BVI, Seychelles, your sort of Singapore, your traditional secrecy jurisdictions. And so these are, these despite, year on year, warning, these continue to be an issue. Not too much has really been done, and so. I think that there's clearly continues to be room in this space for additional efforts to increase transparency. In part and parcel, right? When you speak to banks, large, small, this is the thing that complicates due diligence and know your customer process and procedures, is the ability to obfuscate beneficial ownership information and the inability to have complete transparency across jurisdictions. Now, I don't want to necessarily say that argue for a specific policy to somehow increase transparency across countries. But this is what the issue is, right? And this is what allows North Korea to continue to hide its activities and continue to, for the most part, maintain access to the international financial system. So.
Great, thank you. Just one more question on corporate service providers. There's a question here from someone who works for a corporate service provider. And says that in their jurisdiction, CSPs are well regulated and supervised, but accept that that might not be the case in other jurisdictions. So the specific question is, were there any specific jurisdictions involving corporate service providers in cases you have encountered?
So I'm sorry, Emil, can you repeat the question? I didn't catch the last part. Did you ask for specific corporate service providers or specific jurisdictions?
Specific jurisdictions where CSPs have particularly been involved. I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask it anyways, because I think it's pretty global, isn't it?
So it is relatively global. The concentration tends to be in East and Southeast Asia, but this is probably more of a geographic co-location function, because we also see corporate registries in British Virgin Islands, for example. I will say this is a very interesting trend. Subsequent to the broader transparency policies in UK and BVI regarding beneficial ownership information, we have seen a very marked shift from BVI to other jurisdictions that continue to be less transparent with the beneficial ownership information. I will say this too. So here's the other thing that I think is very frustrating, both from an investigative perspective, but also from a banking perspective, is that it's actually also not just, I think that corporate service providers, there's clearly a transparency problem, right? By the same token, there's also an identity management problem. It's very common, we find that a lot of these these shell companies, that the directors are proxy directors, right? And in many cases, the people have no affiliation with the network, and in some cases don't even know that they're listed on these companies as a director or a shareholder. And so I think that this is potentially an avenue for banks, for corporate service providers to conduct additional compliance to run down the true identities of some of these people, that just because they have, someone applies and they have a national ID, a photograph, and a few phone number, email address, doesn't mean necessarily that that's the person that you're talking to, and that I think so. Greater identity management, I think could potentially go a long way, and offers, I think, generally better avenues for implementing for compliance with some of these sanctions regimes.
Great. And then finally, before we move on to other types of questions, there's a question here about to what extent are the DPRK's illicit financial activities in sub-Saharan Africa related to or facilitated by Chinese companies and individuals. And I'll expand that to say any third country company and individual, because it does talk, the report talks quite a lot about DPRK nationals. Mm-hmm. So to what extent does it also involve third country nationals, and what are the trends that you're seeing there?
So that's a good question. As of yet, we have not found, as of yet, it tends to be only DPRK nationals. In one instance, we believe there may have been there was a subcontracting relationship, but we have not yet determined whether or not this was incidental or intentional. So it's a very good question, and this is a significant investigative line for myself and the panel.
Great, thank you. So let's move on. There's a couple of questions around cyber and cryptocurrency. So I'd like to go into that now. There's one question here from Joe Byrne, who's also a research analyst here at RUSI, working in the Sandstone team that you mentioned earlier, Aaron. And he asks, how important have the cyber raids been given the fact that exports such as coal, iron ore, and etc. have been blocked for so long? So yeah. How important are the cyber raids to make up for the loss of those exports? I think the question is asking.
So Joe, you mean how important are DPRK's sort of revenue generation activities and relative to its revenue generating through coal and other activities? Not that you don't mean like law enforcement raiding like for virtual assets, correct?
No, I think it's about the revenues generated through cyber hacks.
So not entirely clear. We know that, I mean, it's a substantial revenue stream relative to their traditional. I don't know if anyone really has a significant understanding of the total amount of revenue that North Korea generates a year. I mean, there's sort of estimates, and nowadays, I guess we could say that cryptocurrency, is a significant component of that, but not it's not, I'd say, the most significant. I think that, the traditional, the bread and butter continues to be, coal and, seafood and, other, licensing, things like that. it also, I mean, I think there's a lot of variables with the virtual assets, the price of the virtual asset, right? The ability to launder it. And I think that a key takeaway is that we've seen a increase, we've seen an increase in sophistication, right? And we now know a little bit more about the laundering mechanism. So I suspect that, they see this as a success. They stole the money, they got away with it. So I suspect that this activity will likely continue. So we can't discount the fact that these cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin specifically, prices increasing rapidly, and I think that makes it an attractive target for Dprk cyber activities. So we assess that especially continuing with limit in a situation under during COVID where travel restrictions continue to remain in place, that this offers a valuable the targeting virtual asset service providers and cryptocurrencies is a very valuable approach for North Korea's revenue generating activities, and will likely remain so.
Yeah, I wonder, so when we had the revenue generating or the sanctions targeting revenue generating activities, you mentioned seafood, and there was also textiles, and of course a lot of the media reporting often focuses on the big ticket items like coal and the export of coal and the import of oil. And I don't think we hear very much about seafood and textiles and the continued revenue being generated from those sources. I guess because they're not easy to identify, but I wonder to what extent you have seen anything on those types of commodity groups, mostly because it is not something I've seen very many reports about that continuing or not after the sanctions came into place.
So actually, let me approach this again from sort of the finance angle, because my colleague is the one that JK, who handles the commodities portfolio. But the trading commodities, textiles, and the trading coal, seafood is predominantly an activity that we see in East Asia, mostly China. And unfortunately, this is where we lack a great deal of insight. Now, we continue, in terms of financing, we continue to see the same techniques and tactics employed in terms of the use of, shell companies that obfuscate beneficial ownership information, the use of sort of, how did they describe it? I think it was described as like a ledger system in a previous report of using your various accounts as a system of credits and debits, to pay various vendors or suppliers, things like that. So we continue to see that activity occurring. We don't have a great deal of insight, we don't have a great deal of insight into how much revenue this is generating. We do have a pretty good understanding that a lot of this is related to overseas labor, and we do have an understanding that since late fall 2019, when travel restrictions started to come into place, a lot of the repatriation activities sort of came to a halt. And so I think one of the things that we're curious to see as to whether or not there will be those repatriation activities will resume now that travel restrictions are lifting to a degree. So.
Great, thank you. So I promised we would move on to crypto, and then I distracted us from that. So there's a question here from Kayla Eisenman, also at RUSI and our resident crypto expert. She notes the mentions in the report of the growing risk of peer-to-peer crypto trading platforms being abused for laundering of cryptocurrency and turning them into fiat. And she also notes that the FATF is, of course, likely to come out with recommendations on this very soon. So her question is, what steps can countries take to mitigate this threat of peer-to-peer crypto trading platforms as relates to North Korea?
I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. I think, look, part of the problem is that a virtual asset, it's not designed to be, the whole conceptually, it's not designed to be unregulated. But it's designed to not have an intermediary, right? It's disintermediation. And I think that this conceptually poses a major problem for regulatory authorities. How do you deal with an asset that, I could just as easily send it to you on a USB drive. I could mail you a hard copy. I could put it on the blockchain, right? So I don't know. I think this is a tough problem. The U.S. In some of its more recent reforms, put various types of virtual asset service providers as a covered financial institutions, making them subject to reporting requirements. I think that as an initial step, that is good. That if you are, providing brokering services, they should probably be covered as a money service business and subject to reporting requirements. Beyond that, your guess is as good as mine, because there's really not much in the way of transparency that can be gathered. Identity management, again, is another, I think, key issue in this space. So perhaps there's room for more introspective or more discussion around what would be an appropriate approach to ensure identity, and to ensure identity management on these platforms.
Yeah. There's a question here related to that, which is talking about, I think it's talking about kind of technical solutions to cryptocurrency, IT technologies, whether you have any recommendations or if there's any best practice examples that you can highlight. And I'm not sure if you do have that, but I wanted to ask it in case that you did.
No, unfortunately, I don't. And, this is another area that, I think identity management tends to come up frequently, and it's maybe something that I should sort of focus on for the next report's recommendations, or some areas to flesh out a little bit more, because it is so cross-cutting. And in fact, when speaking with, in our last report, when speaking with companies that were involved in wow, I'm blanking. A freelance service provider. Identity management was one of their sort of key problems, right? How do you ensure that your customer is who they say they are? And I think that while the approaches that are common that I heard, these included, video interviews, the submission of national identification cards, things like that. These are all fine, but exploitable. And so in an online or virtual space, I don't know if there's really any like what I would call an assured way, as of yet. But this continues to be a problem for financial institutions, for other industries that interface or are exposed to North Korean sanctions evasion activity, like the freelance sector, like the virtual asset service providers.
Great. I want to stay on the topic of the FATF a little bit more. We mentioned FATF's work in cryptocurrency, and previously I mentioned FATF's new requirement on proliferation financing risk assessments. So first, a yes and no question, and depending on your answer, I will then ask you a follow-up question. That's okay. So what is the view of the UN Dprk panel of experts regarding the new changes on the FATF standards regarding PF risk assessments? Or I guess the question is, do you have a view on the FATF's risk assessment?
No, I don't think well, first, I'm not going to speak for the panel. I don't know if they have a view on the new FATF guidance. My view I'll speak personally to my view as a personal panel member. So first, always welcome. I mean, any additional guidance on CPF is very much welcome. I tend to have, I think, different views to a degree on proliferation financing than others, in that I don't necessarily see it as a significant difference than other money laundering or type activity. I don't think conceptually it's significantly different. And I apologize for the background noise. That's the baby just woke up. As you mentioned earlier, right, the conceptualization of a risk-based approach at both the national and institutional level, I think, is welcome, and I think, and appropriate in this space. I think actioning this, implementing that, is somewhat subjective and is open to interpretation. And so it will be then curious to see how this is implemented in regions that developing regions that, as we discussed earlier, may have sort of hidden exposure to DPRK sanctions evasion activity that may not be well sort of understood. And how that's taken. My fear, I guess, is that being somewhat open to interpretation, that does leave room for de-risking or risk mitigation strategies that ultimately have an unintended impact on like, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa, right? So I think that as long as financial institutions, national authorities, member states kind of keep those unintended consequences, those potential negative externalities, in the back of their mind, it should be fine. But I'm not convinced that really we'll there'll be a significant that this will contribute in a significant way to broader, more effective sanctions implementation.
Yeah, and there is of course, the added challenge that the FATF standards, or rather the UN sanctions, go far beyond
yes,
the FATF.
Very much so, yeah. And that's in fact, and this is out, that's the other thing too. And so in the FATF guidance, right, it's clearly spelled out that what the scope of the FATF guidance, right? And our approach, obviously, from the panel's perspective, is implementing the UN sanctions, which are, from the financial perspective, very broad, right? Because we talk about supplying directly or indirectly services to North Korean entities. So obviously, from my perspective, I'm always going to think that the guidance is lacking, but that's not to say that it's not necessary or needed in this space. So.
Yeah. Okay, there's a few questions around humanitarian exemptions. So I'm going to try and summarize all the questions we've received on humanitarian banking channels and the work of NGOs, and then you can maybe answer them as one. there's one here around humanitarian agencies and diplomatic missions finding it very difficult to transfer money into the DPRK for their operating costs.
Yeah.
So do you have any views on this and any insights on how this can be overcome? And then related to this, there is a question around, so the discussion around, of course, there's been discussion around creating a banking channel for humanitarian work in the DPRK. And this person asks and want to understand more about the intersection of financial sanctions and humanitarian exemptions. So in such a scenario, would the panel start applying the same standards and would recommend the same due diligence be applied to the work of humanitarian organizations that is being applied to other entities who are operating in kind of highly exposed sectors such as energy or key minerals or even cryptocurrency? So hopefully those make sense. So one question around how do you do the banking channel, and another question around when you have the banking channel, what kind of standards of due diligence and enhanced due diligence might be applied to the work of humanitarian organizations?
Thank you very much. So per the first sort of part of this question about the banking channel, how to do the banking channel. So while the panel makes recommendations about resumption of the banking channel, we generally don't necessarily provide a ton of input in terms of how to facilitate that. That's been a component of the 1718 committee and the Security Council, or I should say within the domain of the 1718 committee. And from my understanding is that they are working towards a solution. I'm really not authorized to speak really kind of where they're at right now on where they are in the process, but it does there does seem to be an indication that it is moving forward, which is good because per the second part of the question, this is something that we have brought up, we have recognized, and probably every single one of our reports since the collapse of the banking channel. One thing that I would like to highlight and bring everyone's attention to is the survey that we conducted. Now, we have my colleague and I, we have limited resources, and we can't necessarily do some of these these really robust surveys the way that RUSI can do surveys with financial institutions. But we did we did send out a survey to I don't know, I think it was more than 30 or so NGOs that conduct humanitarian operations within the DPRK to ask about what their what are their challenges, how have they been faring during the pandemic. And of those that replied, I think it was 11 or so. So it's we can't necessarily do like statistical analysis on it, but I think every single one discussed the challenges with financing their operations, right? So this is a well-known challenge. This is something that the panel is very much aware of and has been bringing it to the attention of the 1718 committee every chance it gets. I think that especially this year, given the shortcomings in humanitarian funding, according to OCHA, right, DPRK is missing its overall funding goal by a mere 30 million. I mean, that's it. It's nothing. It's a rounding error for most governments. That effectively humanitarian aid in the country has stopped, right, due to travel restrictions, due to the banking channel, due to the lack of personnel in country now. So I think I'm hopeful that the banking channel will be reestablished. I had in the back of my mind by third quarter this year. I suspect we may be very much on track, but sort of I don't necessarily want to put that as a hard deadline. But the consequences of this past year of 2020 are going to be significant, undoubtedly, for the civilian population of DPRK. And so it will be very much important that I think that financial institutions that are, that have customers and clients in this space do take appropriate steps to ensure that they are able to finance their humanitarian operations.
Thanks. There's an interesting question here that I want to bring in, which is about the EU and the EU's role in DPRK counterproliferation efforts compared to the role that the US and China takes, where they're more prominently involved. And the question asks, is leadership on counterproliferation finance a way for the EU to increase its profile as a relevant player regarding North Korea? And perhaps I'll add into that is that a lot of the humanitarian organizations that are operating in North Korea are European. So what role do you see for the EU to perhaps take a greater involvement in the kind of DPRK counterproliferation and proliferation financing space?
I mean, it's a good question. I don't particularly, I don't think I have necessarily a great answer to that in terms of, look, I mean, I follow the UN sanctions regime. I follow the US sanctions regime as a scholar. I don't really follow the EU sanctions regime too closely. Well, I should say EU sort of, AML, policy. I mean, transparency is sort of the name of the game, right? And I wouldn't necessarily say that CPF is a path forward in leadership in this area, but I think that AML best practices and transparency is the way forward in this effort. Because to me, it never really is about when it comes to counterproliferation financing and sanctions implementation. It really has nothing to do with the specific regime. It has more to do with transparency and beneficial ownership. This is precisely the problem and touches on not only DPRK illicit activity, proliferation, but human trafficking, narco trafficking, illegal trade in wildlife, tax avoidance, and so I think that there are common approaches to these issues, and that's I think that's where EU leadership can be found.
Great, thanks, Aaron. I'll just do two final questions. If you can keep your answers short, because we're coming up towards the end. Hopefully they shouldn't be too difficult to answer. There's a question around overseas workers who generate revenues for the DPRK. I remember when we did this briefing this time last year, we talked about it being too early to tell how the implementation of the ban on overseas workers was going, and particularly the revenue raising created by those workers. Is there anything you can update there, or anything you can say about progress, or whether cases are still ongoing?
Good question. Yeah, I think we would like to see more progress. There are the cases that we put to the report. I think I was very much surprised with Corman Construction, for example, to see how easy it was to just change your trading name and continue to operate despite literally having the name Mansudae, a well-known and well-sanctioned entity. And we find that I think that we're finding that frequently, that it's far easier to change the trading name and continue business operations as usual. And as we noted in the Corman Construction case, all of that happened despite assurances that those members' visas had been revoked and they had been removed from the country pursuant to the repatriation. So we know that activity continues to occur. Now, I don't know the motive behind this, and for all intents and purposes, with respect to my work, it doesn't really matter. We really just are looking for the act and intent to a degree. But I guess the short answer is that we'd like to see more progress, and we're very much aware that much of the activity or Dprk continues to have significant overseas labor networks. And actually, I should say this too, that while in this last report, we examined and emphasized a couple cases and networks in sub-Saharan Africa, that does not mean that we're not interested in other areas. So IT labor is another sort of significant area. And a lot of that, the IT labor is predominant, again, in China, East Asia, Russia, Eastern Europe. Where we see these are not hackers, right? These aren't the RGB. These are people that do low-level sort of IT labor, like web scraping, low-level app development, things like that. And it generates small amounts of revenue, but these network, you have a large network. Over time you generate substantial amounts of revenue. So that's something that I think that again. We continue to want to be focused on, and from what we understand, especially with the IT labor networks, identity management continues to be a major issue.
Great. And then the final question, you mentioned Mansude already. The final question is around the new types of entities and new entity names mentioned in the report, specifically engaged in construction of export and construction of art projects and public infrastructure projects.
Yeah,
it's often been within the remit of Mansude. Do you think the involvement of new companies is an obfuscation tactic, or is it that actual new players are entering the space and there's opportunism by various Dprk stakeholders?
Oh, no. They're definitely generally the same networks that just recycle, the different names. And in fact, it's kind of interesting because I'll get documentation where they've switched to a new trading name, but they haven't quite switched the domain yet. And so they'll use their old email address on a contract, or bank, account, bank application, so they may say, we're Corman Construction, for example, but then they use an MOP, their MOP email address. Now, here's the thing. From my perspective, I'm an individual investigator with zero resources, and that was pretty apparent to me. I'm hoping that financial institutions, can pay attention to kind of the same sort of discrepancies, and those will raise red flags in some of these key areas and regions.
Great, thank you, Aaron. So I think we will draw the discussion to a conclusion there. There's a few questions that I didn't get to. There was one series of questions where I'm not quite sure what was being asked in the question. So if you feel like you haven't had your answer to your question, please feel free to email us, and maybe we can try and answer that question over email. I apologize because I wasn't quite sure what was being asked. So actually, for anyone who would like to get in touch with us at RUSI on our proliferation financing work, you can email us at cpf@rusi.org, where you will reach our outreach and implementation manager, Wojtek Pavlos, who will be happy to help you. So I think that's the end of our briefing today. I want to thank you, Aaron, for agreeing to do this for the second year. We started it as part of a pandemic events schedule, and now we're still in a pandemic. We're still on Zoom, so I really appreciate you agreeing to do this again. It's been very, very informative, and we really appreciate your time.
Neil, thank you guys very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the report. And just as a very final remark, please do feel free to reach out if you do have specific questions. I'd love to interface directly, especially with financial institutions and affected industries. So.
Yeah, I've always found the panel to be extremely helpful and willing to engage with industries and governments from around the world. So I would definitely second that. Before we finish, I also just want to draw attention to our next webinar, which is on the 22nd of April, which will look at the illicit finance, sanctions, and organized crime elements of the recently published UK government integrated review of security, defense, development, and foreign policy strategy. So if you want to hear more about the UK's focus on illicit finance, sanctions, and organized crime networks and its strategy within this, that event is on the 22nd of April, and you can register now on RUSI's website for that event. And as always, if you want to keep be kept up to date on our publications or any events that we do at the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies, please make sure you sign up to the CFCS newsletter, and there's a link there on the slide now for how you do that. Great, thank you everyone for joining. We hope you found it useful, and please get in touch if you have any other questions. Thanks again, Aaron. Really great to have you. Thank you.